Bosun, pipe him aboard.
Aye, aye, sir.
Fire, dress ship.
Very good, sir. Dress ship!
A brief history of man's maritime mastery. Chapter 6. Henry the Navigator, the Explorer Prince. Atlantic storms blow hard on the somber cliffs of Sagres Point. Here, at the southwest tip of Europe, the waves crash into arching caverns and low caves, shattering into a smother of spray. Winds lash the rock, and even the plants seem to cower, never growing higher than a foot. Standing on this desolate promontory, the endless growling of the sea's anger fills your ears, and constant reminder of nature's relentless power. In the 15th century, gazing seaward from this bleak point, you would see no ocean-going ships, for none existed. No mariners were daring enough to venture far beyond the sight of land. Yet it was at Sagres that a man lived who would change all of that, a man who first coaxed cautious Europe onto the broad highway of the sea. Over 500 years ago, Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, made this windswept point his home. Born in 1394, Henry was the fourth son of King John I of Portugal and his English queen. At just 21, he led Portugal's knights against the Moorish stronghold of Ceuta in North Africa. Given the southern province of Portugal called the Algarve, Henry, still in his 20s, retired to a simple retreat at Sagres. His chronicler, Azurara, described him as big and strong of limb. His hair of color naturally fair, but with constant toil and exposure had become dark. His expression at first sight inspired fear in those who did not know him, and when wroth, though such times were rare, his countenance was harsh. Strength of heart and keenness of mind were in him to a very excellent degree, and beyond comparison. He was ambitious of achieving great and lofty deeds. All his days were passed in the greatest of toil. His palace was a school of hospitality for all the good and high-born of the realm, and still even more for strangers. Henry never married, nor did he take a regular place at court. He did not sail to strange places, discovered nothing personally, and left few records beyond the stones of Sagres. Yet this brooding prince lit and sustained the flame of discovery, forever changing the thinking of the world. Henry's world was small, a medieval Christian enclave huddled on the edge of Asia, known as Europe, imprisoned by a Muslim empire that stretched from the Middle East to Gibraltar, and by superstitions that shackled the mind. Ships, it was believed, were too frail to challenge the open oceans, and men too fearful to try. But Europe was wakening. The force known as the Renaissance was stirring, and the horizons of the mind were retreating before a revival of classic learning and bold ventures into science and art. The horizons of the earth, too, would soon be pushed back by Prince Henry's ships and the men he inspired to seek out the unknown. Another powerful force driving the age of exploration was the hunger for spices. Europe's drab diet offered few vegetables, few fruits, little sugar, no tea, coffee, or chocolate. Fresh meat was scarce in the winter, with animals butchered in the fall for lack of fodder. Pungent flavorings were more than a luxury. They were essential to enliven this fare and, more critically, to conceal the putridity of aging meat. Spices were believed to cure many ills, extolled as aphrodisiacs, and sought for balms, incense, and perfumes. But their cost was nearly prohibitive. Nutmeg or cloves, worth little in their native East Indies, traveled a torturous and costly road to Europe. Malay and Hindu merchants shipped them to India, where the Arab monopoly took over, bringing them to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea. From there, camel caravans transported the precious cargo to Alexandria and Beirut, where Genoese and Venetian ships carried them to city-states that distributed them across Europe. Each handler took a profit, and the costs pyramided to a price that only the wealthy could afford. The Muslim belt around southern Europe shrouded this spice trade in mystery and guarded it fiercely with the sword. It was only on the sea that Prince Henry could hope to outflank Islam and break the Arab stranglehold on Europe. He sought not only to extend Portugal's trade and power, but also to increase geographical knowledge and spread Christianity. Henry also hoped to make contact with Prester John, a legendary Christian king whose fabled realm was believed to lie somewhere to the east. The prince's plan was audacious: to push ships down the uncharted west coast of Africa and map the unknown. In time, his captains would reach the Indian Ocean, the gateway to the empires of the Orient. Others had dreamed of this goal. More than a century before Henry was born, 2 Genoese ships had sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar and headed south, hoping to reach the ports of India by sea. That was the last ever heard of them. Seamen, conservative and fearful, knew of such disasters and respected the sea's power. Prince Henry had a monumental task ahead of him: to incite a revolution in navigation. The first step was to improve the art of navigating itself. Navigating by guesswork and by eye would not get ships far into the unknown. Medieval Europeans knew only 2 methods: piloting, which involved sailing within sight of land, and dead reckoning, a method of deduction that determined the ship position by noting compass course, speed, elapsed time, drift from the wind, and set from the current. Masters achieved surprising accuracy by dead reckoning, but they avoided longer voyages over open sea where they could not coast. Knowledge of coasts, ports, harbors, landfalls, departures, distances, and courses was a closely guarded treasure, preserved in manuscript books held by individual pilots, not shared among mates and masters. At Sagres, Prince Henry assembled a remarkable team: mathematicians, chart makers, astronomers, pilots, master mariners, students, and chroniclers of the voyages. They came from across Europe: Portuguese, Spaniards, Jews, Arabs, Italians, all converging at the first navigational school in Europe. Together, they helped Henry create better charts, improve essential shipboard instruments like the compass, astrolabe, and quadrant, and compile more detailed astronomical tables. This gathering of the minds at Sagres sparked a revolution. It was here, at the edge of the known world, that the tools and knowledge were forged, allowing ships to venture beyond the horizon and into the vast unknown, setting the stage for the great age of discovery. Under Prince Henry's supervision, a transformation began. The simple, square-rigged vessels of the day, round-bellied cargo carriers, often with just one large sail, were no longer sufficient. Before a favorable wind, they might eventually reach their destination as the Lord willed, but they were of little use when tacking against the wind. The Arabs had a good, fast design in the lithe dhow with its lateen sails, able and weatherly, but also weak, ideal for sailing before a gentle monsoon winds, but not for the storm-tossed winds of western seas. Why not combine the best of these 2 types of ships? This question led to the creation of the Portuguese caravel. There is strong evidence that the prince's coterie designed the caravel. It is certain that his shipyards at the port of Lagos near Sagres built these vessels. The caravels had strong European holds capable of stowing ample supplies, and supported 2 or 3 masts with fore and aft lateen rigs. Larger caravels featured 1 big square sail and topsail on the foremast, which drove them before the wind, while 2 more masts carried the lateen sails, perfect for sailing off the wind or tacking against it. These ships, ranging from 100 to 200 tons, were comparatively cheap to rig and man, giving Prince Henry's mariners more range, speed, and maneuverability than any seaman had previously enjoyed. Stories abounded of lost lands, mysterious places, legendary perhaps, but consistently named on ancient charts. St. Brendan's Isle, an ill-defined place called Brazil, no connection to the Brazil we now know today, and a group of islands called Antilia. From Lagos, Prince Henry's first explorers ventured out into the Atlantic to see for themselves. In 1420, 2 of them returned with exciting news. A storm had driven them onto the Madeiras. Henry wasted no time. He sent colonists, and with them, crops of grapes from Crete. Soon lush vineyards draped the isles. By 1432, his emboldened seafarers had reached the Azores, 1,000 miles over the western sea. But beyond those islands lay only endless stretches of water. harassed by great storms, with wind and current mainly from the west. The way to the Indies, it seemed, certainly did not lie there. No, the path would open up only after relentless searching voyages along the coast of Africa. Prince Henry sent his ships south, ship after ship after ship. But progress was slow. The seamen were superstitious, the sea was unknown to them, and imagined dangers seemed very real. Medieval scholars had written with macabre relish about the horrors of the torrid zone, and now Henry was asking his sailors to venture directly into it. These men, navigating uncharted waters and braving the unknown, were not just explorers. They were pioneers of a new world, driven by their prince's vision. And as their ships ventured further, they would forever change the maps, the trade routes, and the destiny of nations. The big barrier, the one that haunted the dreams of sailors and scholars alike, was Cape Bojador. Not even 1,000 miles from Sagres, and barely noticeable on a map, this modest angle of the Sahara jutting into the sea marked the line where geographical knowledge ended and mythical terrors began. Beyond its turbulent shallows lay the fabled Sea of Darkness, a place where it was said white men would turn black, lost to the world forever. Azurara, Prince Henry's chronicler, captured the dread in his writings. Beyond this there is no race of men or place of inhabitants, nor is the land less sandy than the deserts of Libya, where there is no water, no tree, no green herb. The sea is so shallow that a whole league from land is only a fathom deep, while the currents are so terrible that no ship, having once passed the cape, will ever be able to return. For 19 years, Henry's captains dared not cross this ominous threshold. The cry was always the same: go back while we may." But one day, a man braver than the rest defied these fears. This was Gil Yenis, a courtier turned conqueror of myths. Yenis had to make 2 attempts. On his first, he came within sight of the cape, but his sailors, seeing the water boiling on the other side, refused to round it. From the masthead they could see a great swirling in the sea, a sign, they declared, of boiling waters and adverse currents. No place but to go back. And so, back they went. When Gil Yenis returned to Sagres, he reported the strange phenomenon to Prince Henry. Disappointed but undeterred, the prince reassured the captain. "The sea is not boiling," he explained, "but racing at ebb tide over shoals." The prince had seen this same behavior along their own coasts. In 1434, Gil Yenis set sail for the feared cape once more, this time with a different crew. When they saw the water boil again, he sailed on, skirting the shoals just as the prince had predicted. Having found one myth baseless, Yenis pressed on, determined to conquer the others. After a 7-year interruption during which Henry was preoccupied with fighting the Muslims, another captain, Antao Goncalves, was sent beyond the desert belt. He sailed into the zone where the black men reside and returned to Sagres with captives, an act that, though it brought new knowledge, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the world's insidious fascination with slave trade. The Portuguese baptized these captives, pampered them, and absorbed many into their population. But with this voyage, a new shadow of slavery began to stretch across Africa. From 1444 to 1446, Prince Henry licensed 30 voyages. Dinis Diaz rounded Cape Verde. Alvaro Fernandez neared Sierra Leone. The discovery of the Cape Verde Islands naturally followed these explorations. Yet, despite these milestones, the reports from his trusted discoverers must have profoundly discouraged the prince. Each voyage returned with the same frustrating news. Africa still stretched away as far as the eye could see. The endless coast seemed a mockery, and Henry's explorations were increasingly ridiculed as expensive absurdities. But Prince Henry was not a man to be swayed by ridicule. He carried on, pouring his revenues from the Algarve into these relentless ventures. The money from rich tuna fishing, from the olive and cork trees, from almonds and grain, all of it flowed into the coffers of Sagres. His own wants were simple: a chapel, a lookout, a rough bed. The only luxuries at Sagres were reserved for the endless stream of map-makers and mariners who came to study at Prince Henry's school, where the dream of discovery was kept alive. As the little caravels inched their way down the great bulge of Africa, their crews began to find treasures, gold dust, ivory, and more slaves. Some captains became more interested in trade than in discovery. It was asking a lot to pass up such rich profits, and as trading stations rose along the coasts, many went no farther. Others, searching for gold up turbid rivers, fell to poisoned darts fired from ambush. Prince Henry was undeterred. Patiently he quizzed the captains who had turned traitors, the survivors of the ambushes, the natives who were brought to him, and the men who persevered in exploring. His instructions remained unchanged. Go on, go south. By the time Henry the Navigator died in 1460, his caravels had reached Sierra Leone, still only a third of the way down Africa. Yet the momentum of his efforts drove his captains onward. The real fruits of his labor came after his death. The Crown took over the task of discovery. Now the caravels slipped out of Lisbon and down the Tagus River, bound for Africa. Around the bulge of the continent they dodged captains, probed the coast of Guinea, and ran eastward. Here they named its lands for the trade they offered: the grain coast, the ivory coast, the gold coast, and the slave coast. They even erected a great stone castle on the Gold Coast. It is said that Christopher Columbus, sailing with the Portuguese in the early 1480s, visited this castle of Mina. We can imagine him learning much about the men who were still its masters, their drive for discovery, their persistence in the face of adversity, and their closely kept sailing secrets. Still, the coast ran eastward. Could this at last be the end of the continent? But after 1,000 miles, the discoverers found themselves stopped again by bulking land that stretched indeterminably south. Would it ever end? The seamen were finding the sailing more arduous. In the northern hemisphere, the wind and current had been with them. Getting back was the difficulty. Once in the southern hemisphere, conditions changed. Winds blew from the south and southeast. The famous trade winds and the coastal currents set 10 to 30 miles a day to the north. It says a great deal for the seaworthiness of the Portuguese caravels that they were even able to continue. By 1484, Diogo Cao had pushed nearly 6,000 miles south, setting up stone pillars called padroes at important points. He came within 1,000 miles of the end of the continent and set the stage for Bartholomew Dias. Little is known about the gallant Dias, for Portugal cloaked her explorations in a conspiracy of silence. Lisbon and Lagos swarmed with spies from nations interested in thwarting Portuguese discoveries, or profiting from them what they found. But we do know that Dias fitted out his 2 ships of discovery with special care, adding something other explorers would copy: a supply ship with extra provisions for the ever-lengthening voyages. Dias sailed in 1487 and touched at several points down the African coast. He passed the southernmost pillar erected by Diogo Cao. And then the sketchy record tells us that a hard wind blew him off the land and sped him southward, driving him on for another 13 days. When the huge seas finally abated, he sailed eastward, expecting to connect with the coast. None appeared, so he finally turned north. Finally, mountains rose over the horizon, but before mutinous crews could turn him back, Dias planted a pillar and determined that the coast trended northeastward. He had reached Africa's far side. Hugging the shore on his return, he discovered the continent's tip. An elated Portugal named it the Cape of Good Hope, for surely the way to India now lay open. This is the standard story about Dias. But a 13-day gale is a mighty long storm, anywhere except perhaps off Iceland, and it supposedly blew him southward against the prevailing winds. Without these 2 unlikely circumstances, Dias could not have rounded the Cape. Some postulate that he deliberately stood seaward and then south. But how did he know this was the only way? Perhaps he had an inspired hunch, or perhaps he had prior knowledge from those lost records of that sea school in Sagres. The conspiracy of silence veiled many voyages in secrecy. Perhaps earlier unknown captains had told Bartholomew Dias of the Cape's winds and currents. No matter how it happened, Diaz's doubling down of the Cape of Good Hope was an epical event, the triumph of Prince Henry's dreams. Now, as the Navigator had foreseen, Europe could sail its way out of its medieval bonds. After the pioneering caravels emblazoned with the cross of Christ would come the carracks and the galleons, the great naus of the passage of India, to sail on their stately voyages for the next 2 centuries. For in the very decade that Henry died, the man was born who would finally achieve the first Portuguese footing in the Indies. He paved the way for an empire that encompassed half the earth and fulfilled the vision of the recluse prince. His name was Vasco da Gama.